My husband's mom told him to choose, so I packed his bags and stayed in the house. That sentence might sound like the final act of a drama, but for me, it was just the beginning of a quiet, necessary reckoning. My name is Naya Rivera. I'm 34 years old, a visual arts lecturer at a liberal arts college just outside Atlanta, Georgia, and until last year, I thought marriage was a partnership built on patience, effort, and mutual protection. I didn't expect that one day I'd be left standing in my own hallway, 7 months pregnant, watching my husband carry a suitcase down the steps he helped paint, unable to look me in the eye. I met Elias Carter at an alumni fundraiser for a literacy nonprofit. He worked in publishing, tall and well-spoken. With a laugh that broke through any stiffness in the room, I was there to display student art pieces, and he asked about the brushstrokes in one of the oil portraits. He didn't pretend to know more than he did. He listened. That's what struck me first. 2 years later, we were married in an intimate ceremony behind my aunt's house under a canopy of magnolia trees. His mother, Delilah, wore pale silver and didn't smile once. I chalked it up to grief, since his father had passed away the year before. But now I'm not so sure that grief was what made her eyes linger coldly on mine as we exchanged vows. Delilah Carter was a name people in the Atlanta private school and donor circles whispered with either reverence or caution. Her family had old money, old traditions, and older expectations. She believed in legacy, image, and control. I didn't fit. My father was a Cuban-American high school teacher. My mother, a second-generation nurse from North Carolina. I went to public school, paid my way through college with scholarships and freelance art jobs, and had no famous maiden name to soften my entry into their world. Still, I believed love would be enough. Elias said he admired my independence. He said his mother would come around. And for a while, it almost seemed like she might. The first cracks appeared early. Though, little things, she'd invite us for dinner, but only cook dishes Elias liked. She'd send holiday cards addressed to Mr. Elias Carter and guessed even after we were married. She gave us antique china as a housewarming gift and then asked me not to use it because those pieces are family heritage and you wouldn't know how to store them properly. Elias always shrugged, said she had high standards and that we shouldn't take it personally. But over time, the excuses began to wear thin. The home we moved into was a modest brick colonial in a quiet, leafy neighborhood just outside the city. I loved it from the moment I saw the sunlight pour across the hardwood floors in the entryway. We bought it with help from both our savings, but because my credit score was better, the mortgage and deed went under my name alone. We told ourselves we'd fix that once Elias paid off some remaining student debt. That plan lingered on the to-do list for 2 years. When Delilah visited for the first time, she brought a measuring tape, said she wanted to help us elevate the space. I smiled politely, even when she walked through each room as if appraising it for auction. At one point, she ran her hand across the mantel and said, "Well, at least the bones are good. Elias, you always had a knack for spotting potential." She didn't include me in that sentence. And I felt the omission like a slap. Still, I held my tongue. That's what I did. Again and again, I held my tongue. I let her rearrange my kitchen cabinets while Elias said nothing. I listened to her veiled comments about family bloodlines and raising children with tradition while pretending not to notice that she only ever said those things when I was in the room. The real shift came when I got pregnant. Elias and I hadn't been trying, but we weren't preventing it either. The day I saw those 2 pink lines, I cried alone in the bathroom, then laughed, then cried again. I waited until dinner to tell him. He picked me up and twirled me in the kitchen, kissing me between breaths, saying, "We're going to be parents," like it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And for one brief week, I believed everything would finally settle into place. Until he told his mother. Her reaction was so measured it chilled me. She didn't shout. She didn't slam a door. She just said, "I hope the child looks like you," and walked away. That's when I understood that she wasn't going to adjust. She was going to escalate. And if I didn't start paying attention, I was going to disappear inside my own life. The strange thing is, in the beginning, it really did feel like love. Not just the kind they write into movies, but the quiet, stable kind. The kind that makes you believe maybe you were wrong to be so guarded all those years. Elias wasn't flashy or loud. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He made coffee in the mornings without being asked and folded laundry while humming off key to Marvin Gaye. We shared a rhythm, the kind couples often grow into after years. But for us, it came early. He'd sneak notes into my sketchbooks, asking where I wanted to travel next. He learned the names of my favorite illustrators and went to every student gallery I curated, even the ones with awkward lighting and uneven canvases. When we bought the house, he insisted we paint the nursery even before we were ready to have a baby, said it was a symbol of hope. We chose a soft green called Meadow Breeze. The only argument we had was over whether to hang a mobile made of paper cranes or cloud-shaped cutouts. We went with both. Delilah didn't say much about our decorating choices at first. She walked through the hallway like a real estate agent, judging a listing she hadn't decided to buy. When I asked what she thought, she smiled and said, "It's modest," which, coming from her, was already a minor victory. Still, I tried. I invited her to dinner once a month, made recipes from Elias's childhood, even tried to remember which china she preferred for what course. But no matter how carefully I chose my words, or how neutral I kept my tone, she found ways to remind me I was still the outsider, like the time she arrived an hour early and found me in sweats with flour on my face, then smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry, I didn't expect formal wear. You're busy, I'm sure." Or when she gifted Elias cufflinks on our first anniversary and told him, right in front of me, "Real men never forget where they come from." Elias would always shrug it off with that same half-laugh, that quiet diplomacy that looked like peacekeeping from the outside but felt like avoidance from within. He'd say things like, "You know how she is," or "She doesn't mean anything by it." And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But it's hard to believe someone's harmless when they keep poking holes in your boat and smiling while they do it. It wasn't just the passive remarks or the selective invitations. It was the pattern. The slow, careful erosion of space. One weekend, we came back from a cabin getaway and found that Delilah had stopped by to drop off some family heirlooms and left them arranged across our mantel and bookshelf like a curated exhibit. She didn't ask. She just assumed. A portrait of Elias's grandfather replaced a painting I'd made in grad school. A crystal vase pushed aside the small ceramic owl my mother gave me when I got my first teaching job, when I moved things back the next day. Elias said nothing, just watched me with tired eyes and rubbed his temples like he was caught between two radio stations, playing different versions of the truth. At work, I threw myself into teaching. My students lit me up in a way nothing else did. Watching them struggle with composition or color theory and then suddenly get it, that quiet click of confidence behind their eyes, made the rest of the chaos feel manageable. But coming home felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. I started staying late in my studio, telling myself I had prep work. But really, I just didn't want to walk into a house where I felt like I was slowly being erased. Then the micro replacements started. I noticed Delilah had swapped the hand soap in our guest bathroom for a brand she preferred. She brought over lemon-scented candles without asking and lit them during dinner, even though citrus made me nauseous. One afternoon, I found my books alphabetized differently, my shoes rearranged in the closet. Elias swore he hadn't done it. "Maybe you're just forgetting how you left things," he said, and I stared at him, wondering if he genuinely believed that or if he was just too afraid to face the alternative. The shift wasn't sudden. That's the trick. It crept in like fog, soft and slow, until you couldn't remember the last time the air felt clear. And somewhere along the way, the man who used to hold my hand during faculty mixers and whisper funny observations about the art snobs began slipping into silence when his mother spoke over me at dinner. Somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing that I had stopped speaking. When the pregnancy test came back positive, I thought it might realign everything. That's the delusion they don't warn you about. That a baby might fix what grown adults refuse to face. I told him with a shaky laugh, and he cried into my shoulder. I thought that meant we'd start pulling in the same direction again. Instead, all it did was raise the stakes. Delilah's reaction was subtle, but sharp. She asked how far along I was before saying congratulations. She brought over herbal teas I wasn't sure were safe and insisted on scheduling appointments with the best OB in her circle. She began referring to the nursery as the family room. She never said which family. That's when I started documenting. Not because I planned to use it against anyone, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't imagining what was happening, that it wasn't hormones or overthinking, that the line between tension and control had already been crossed, and that pretending otherwise wouldn't save me. It started with her spare key. Technically, we'd given it to her for emergencies, but somewhere along the line, the definition of emergency became whatever Delilah wanted it to mean. I came home early from a prenatal checkup one Thursday and found her in our bedroom, not startled in the slightest, just calmly rearranging the dresser drawers while humming to herself. She said she was helping me get organized before things get overwhelming. I stood there in silence, watching her lift a folded nightgown and place it somewhere else as if it were her room. I told Elias that night. He blinked slowly, rubbed his chin like he was processing something complicated, and then said, "She probably just thought she was being helpful. You know she doesn't mean anything by it." And I did know. That was the problem. She meant everything by it. She meant to erase me inch by inch until the space stopped feeling like mine. After that, I began noticing signs of her presence even when she wasn't around. My sketchbooks moved from the coffee table to the closet. Fresh fruit I bought disappeared, replaced with the bland brands she preferred. One evening, I opened the pantry to find that she'd labeled every spice jar in calligraphy. She had rewritten the names of things I had chosen. That felt like the point. Elias kept insisting she was trying. But trying what? Trying to insert herself into a space that wasn't hers, trying to undo the life we had built when I asked him that. He sighed and said, "She's just always been hands-on. It's how she shows she cares." But I noticed he no longer looked me in the eye when he said those things. I think part of him knew he was repeating lines he no longer fully believed. As my belly grew, so did the intensity. Delilah started planning family dinners at our house, inviting people without asking, often announcing them last minute like a queen arranging an audience. She'd walk in, comment on how tired I looked, and tell me not to worry about cleaning up, then criticize how I'd loaded the dishwasher or folded napkins incorrectly. Once, she brought a guest I'd never met, a woman named Vanessa who, it turned out, Used to date Elias during college. Vanessa just moved back to the city. She said with a smile, "She's been asking about you. Elias, you remember how close you two were?" I stood there holding a tray of glasses, trying not to drop any. After that night, I asked Elias directly why he hadn't said anything. He looked genuinely confused. Say what he asked, like he truly didn't know what part was wrong. That was when I realized he was slipping into a familiar role, the same one he must have played as a child, keeping peace, avoiding conflict, absorbing discomfort like a sponge just to keep things from boiling over. But the trouble is, when someone absorbs everything, they slowly disappear. The nursery became another battlefield. I had picked a gentle theme books and woodland creatures, soft lighting, gender-neutral tones. When Delilah saw it, she frowned. "This doesn't feel like a Carter nursery," she said. "It's too modern, too impersonal." She brought over an antique rocking chair and tried to replace the crib I had chosen with an old bassinet that had been in the family for generations, one that no longer met safety standards. "This cradle rocked Elias to sleep," she said, placing it down with finality, as though the matter were settled. I asked her, gently at first, to leave it in the guest room instead. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. That weekend, I found she had moved the new crib to the attic and set up her family cradle in the center of the nursery, complete with handmade lace sheets. I didn't even hear her come in. When I confronted Elias again, he said something I won't forget. He said, "Maybe she's just trying to feel included. You know this is hard for her too." I stared at him, truly speechless, wondering how he could possibly equate the stress I was carrying with Delilah's bruised sense of legacy. I was growing a human. She was growing resentment. Those weren't the same. The day I found her steaming open a letter from my doctor's office was the day the last sliver of benefit of the doubt disappeared. She claimed it was because she thought it might be related to family insurance. But when I told Elias, he didn't even flinch. He just said, she probably didn't realize it was private. I remember walking into the nursery that night, sitting in the dim light beside the unwanted cradle, and placing both hands on my stomach. I whispered to the baby, "This ends with me," because I knew, deep down, that if I didn't draw the line now, I would spend the rest of my life explaining myself to a woman who never intended to understand me. I wish I could say things got better after that, but if anything, pregnancy made it easier for her to tighten the grip. I was exhausted most days, barely sleeping, and my senses were all over the place. The smallest things overwhelmed me, and Delilah used every crack in my energy to wedge herself further into the spaces I still called mine. She came over more frequently, often without warning, always carrying something that framed her intrusion as helpful: a bag of soup, a stack of parenting books from the 70s, a blanket stitched with Elias's name across the edge, and every time I asked for space. She smiled like I had confused kindness for inconvenience. One morning, I woke up to the smell of something sharp and herbal drifting through the hallway. Delilah had let herself in while we were sleeping and was brewing a pot of what she called a traditional tonic for strong births. I asked what was in it. She wouldn't say. I refused to drink it, and she gave me a look that suggested I had insulted generations of Carter women. Later that week, I found that she had thrown out most of the items on our baby registry and replaced them with what she called family-safe alternatives: a cast-iron baby bathtub, hand-stitched diapers from her church circle, and a series of essential oils I had never approved. I changed the registry settings to private, but it was already too late. Her narrative had taken root. She told extended family members that I was rejecting Carter traditions, that I didn't want the baby to feel part of their lineage. She mentioned my modern preferences like they were contagious. At one dinner, she joked that she hoped the baby wouldn't inherit my tendency to isolate. "It must be hard not having a big family background," she said as she passed the potatoes. Her eyes locked on mine. Elias laughed nervously, but said nothing. I sat there feeling a dull ache grow under my ribs, not from the baby, but from the weight of all the unspoken things Elias should have said. The emotional isolation deepened when Delilah began turning our home into a showcase of her family's past. Framed photos of Elias's childhood replaced the ones we had taken on our honeymoon. She started storing her belongings in our guest closet, claiming she was preparing for longer visits once the baby arrived. And then, without asking, she started sleeping over. The first time, she said her power had gone out. The second time, she claimed concern about a dizzy spell I had mentioned offhandedly. After that, it became routine. She brought her own pillow and a monogrammed robe. I asked Elias, quietly but firmly, if he was okay with this. He said, "It's only temporary. She just wants to feel needed. Don't we all?" That answer felt like the end of something. I didn't know exactly what, but I felt it leave me. It was the moment I understood that love alone wouldn't protect me from being erased. At my 28-week appointment, my doctor pulled me aside after reviewing my blood pressure. She said the levels were higher than normal, likely stress-related, and asked if anything at home had changed. I lied. I said work had been demanding. She told me to rest more, to avoid anxiety. I nodded, but knew that no amount of deep breathing could fix a house where every corner reminded me I was no longer the main character in my own story. A week later, Delilah hosted a brunch in our living room without asking. I came downstairs to find 5 women seated on our couch, all sipping tea and complimenting her on the curtains I had chosen. One of them leaned over and touched my belly without asking. Another asked if I planned to go back to work after the baby, when I said yes. She raised her eyebrows and said, "You know, Elias's mom mentioned you might change your mind once you bond." I looked over at Delilah, who was spreading jam on a biscuit like nothing had happened. That night, I sat on the porch with Elias. I told him this couldn't continue. I asked for a boundary. One, just one. No more unannounced visits, no more registry changes, no more brunches without consent. He listened quietly, nodded slowly, then said, "I'll talk to her, but she's already under a lot of pressure. Maybe we just need to be patient." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't going to act. He was going to wait it out, like he always had. Delilah wasn't just inserting herself into our life. She was rearranging the furniture in our future. And Elias, for all his warmth and sweetness, was handing her the blueprint and asking me to be gracious. I didn't go searching for the truth. It found me when I least expected it, in a quiet moment that felt almost too ordinary to carry the weight it did. I was sitting in the back garden one afternoon, sipping peppermint tea and trying to ease the nausea that hadn't let up in days, when my phone buzzed with a text from Tessa, Elias's cousin. She and I had always had a quiet understanding, never close, but not cold either. The message read, "Can I stop by just me? No drama. I promise." I said yes, mostly because I was too tired to say no. Tessa arrived with a small bag of clementines and a softness in her eyes that felt unfamiliar. She didn't make small talk. She sat down across from me, peeled a fruit, and said, "I need to tell you something about Delilah and about Elias, because I don't think he ever will." Her voice wasn't accusatory, just worn. I nodded slowly, waiting. She told me about a woman named Rachel, someone Elias had dated seriously before me, someone Delilah had never liked. Tessa said Rachel was kind, driven, with a laugh that filled a room. She worked in public health and once helped Elias through a medical scare that no one else even knew about. But Rachel wasn't from a family Delilah approved of. She was raised by a single mother, worked through school, and didn't dress the way Delilah believed a Carter woman should. According to Tessa, Delilah waged a slow, calculated campaign. She fed Rachel misinformation, invited her to family functions only to isolate her, and once moved Elias's belongings out of Rachel's apartment while he was on a work trip, claiming she was helping him come home to his senses. I listened, stunned but not surprised. It all sounded far too familiar. I asked what happened to Rachel. Tessa looked down at her hands. She left, said she couldn't fight someone who was willing to lie with a smile on her face. Elias never chased her. I think part of him believed it was easier that way. I didn't cry. There was nothing left in me for tears. But something shifted then. Something slow and final. I saw myself in Rachel, and I saw the difference. Rachel walked away. I had stayed. I was still staying. And every extra day I lingered in that house without confronting the reality was a day I allowed history to repeat itself with higher stakes this time. That night, Elias came home later than usual. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled and the corners of his mouth downturned like he had been arguing in silence all day. I told him I had spoken with Tessa. He froze, then sat down without a word. I didn't ask for details. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "You never told me what happened before me." He stared at the floor and whispered, "I didn't think it mattered. I thought I could keep it separate. But there is no such thing as separate when the same patterns keep bleeding into the present." I asked him if he truly believed Delilah would ever see me as family. He said nothing. I asked him if he'd ever chosen me in a room where she stood on the other side. His silence was an answer. In the days that followed, I stopped making excuses out loud. I started writing things down instead. I made a list of boundaries I had never dared to enforce. I made another list of things that had quietly disappeared since Delilah began staying over my artwork in the hallway. The shoes I wore on our wedding day, the framed sonogram that used to sit beside our bed. I called Erin, a close friend from college who happened to be a family lawyer, and asked her to explain what legal options I had regarding the house. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then said gently, "You're not crazy. You're just drowning in politeness while someone else builds a life over your body." That night, I didn't confront Elias. I watched him move through the kitchen, saw the weight in his shoulders, the slowness in his hands, and understood that he was collapsing under the pressure. But his collapse didn't mean I had to go down with him. I started putting together a folder, documents, receipts, emails, all quiet preparations, not for a war, but for clarity. Not because I planned to leave that week, but because I wanted to be ready when the day came that silence would no longer be survivable. And it was coming. I could feel it in the way Delilah started walking through the house like she owned it, in the way Elias apologized before every conversation but never changed the outcome. I could feel it in my body. To how my daughter moved stronger every day, how I was no longer carrying just a child, but the full weight of a decision that would shape the world she entered. By the time I entered my 8th month, the silence in our house had taken on a strange weight. It wasn't the calm kind that offers peace, or even the tense kind that makes you brace for a fight. It was hollow. It echoed. Elias had moved into the guest room 2 weeks prior, citing his insomnia and my tossing at night. But we both knew that wasn't the real reason. It gave him space to take late-night calls from Delilah, to whisper without my gaze, to preserve the illusion that avoiding confrontation was the same as protecting his family. One Thursday evening, I came home from a short prenatal yoga class to find a luxury sedan parked in our driveway. I knew the brand, I knew the license plate. I stood at the edge of the steps and counted to 10 before going inside, hoping for calm and finding instead the scent of Delilah's signature hand lotion already settling into the air like an announcement. She was seated at our dining table, arranging a bouquet of hydrangeas she must have brought with her, dressed like she was hosting a garden party. Her voice was bright. "Naya, darling, you're home early. Elias will be here soon. I thought we could all have dinner together." The smile didn't match her eyes. I didn't answer her directly. I put down my bag, washed my hands in the kitchen, and stared at the digital clock on the stove until it felt safe to speak. "Did you need something?" I asked quietly. She tilted her head. "Just to be with my son, with my future grandchild. This house feels like home now." That sentence sat between us, uninvited and unchallenged. I should have said something then, but I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Elias arrived 20 minutes later looking pale, like he hadn't slept in days. He hugged his mother and nodded at me. We sat down for dinner, a silent orchestra of forks and small bites. I picked at a salad I hadn't prepared and drank ice water from a glass I hadn't placed. Then Delilah folded her napkin with deliberate grace and looked at Elias. "Not me. It's time," she said. "You have to choose. This situation is no longer sustainable. Either you come home or you let her drag you down with this experiment." I remember the word experiment landing with such clarity that I nearly dropped my fork. My body froze. But inside something shifted. I watched Elias stare down at his plate, hands trembling slightly, his mouth opening and closing like a man trapped underwater with no air left to give. "Mom, please," he said, barely audible. She leaned in closer, her voice softer now. "Sweetheart, this isn't about punishment. It's about preservation. Your child deserves to be raised in a real Carter home, not in confusion." I sat perfectly still, listening to my husband breathe through his nose, watching his jaw clench and unclench like a hinge that couldn't decide which way to break. He didn't speak, not to me, not to her, not to himself. After several minutes, I stood, not quickly, not dramatically. I just stood, folded my napkin, and walked to the bedroom. I closed the door softly behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and placed both hands on my belly. The baby kicked, firm and steady, as if grounding me to the moment. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. What I felt was clean, cold, clear recognition that nothing more needed to be said, that whatever came next wouldn't be decided by words anymore, but by what I chose to stop allowing. That night, Elias didn't come to the bedroom. Delilah took the guest room. He slept on the couch. Our house, once filled with shared playlists and laughter from late-night games, had become a chessboard, and I was done playing. The next morning, I called Aaron and asked for a meeting. I wanted everything clarified: property rights, custodial planning, financial access. I didn't tell Elias. I didn't tell anyone except her. That night, I started packing up a few things not to leave. but to prepare. Because when people think you're not ready to walk away, they act like they own the ground you stand on. I intended to remind them it was mine. The night after Delilah's ultimatum, I slept better than I had in weeks, not because things were fixed, but because something inside me had finally stopped twisting. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for Elias to defend me, not for Delilah to soften, and not for some imaginary resolution where everyone suddenly decided to do better. I woke up to the smell of cinnamon Delilah baking something in my kitchen, probably to make the next scene feel domestic. The effort was wasted. I had no intention of sitting through another performance. I got dressed, tied my hair back, and went downstairs like I owned the space. Because I did. She looked up from a tray of pastries and smiled like nothing had happened. David will be down shortly. We'd like to talk before the day gets away from us. Her tone was light, practiced, like she was announcing a brunch itinerary, not the slow dismantling of someone else's marriage. I poured myself a glass of water and said nothing. A few minutes later, Elias came down, eyes puffy and steps slow. He looked like someone who had stayed up all night trying to rewrite a script he didn't have the courage to finish. He sat across from me and fidgeted with the edge of the placemat. I think maybe some space might help. He said without looking at me, I just don't know how to fix this right now. That sentence wasn't surprising, but it still settled in my chest like a stone. I nodded, calm and still, and replied, okay. The silence that followed was thick with Delilah's expectation for chaos. I saw it in the way she blinked rapidly, waiting for tears, waiting for drama, waiting for me to fall apart so she could feel justified. But none of that came. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and pulled out the suitcase Elias kept in the back of our closet for work trips. I packed it with precision, comfortable clothes, chargers, toiletries, nothing passive-aggressive, no notes, no accusations, just what he needed to leave comfortably. When I zipped the suitcase shut, I felt something shift, not collapse, just clarity. I carried the suitcase to the front hallway and set it down gently. Elias stood there watching me, looking like a man caught between two collapsing buildings. I don't know if this is what I want, he whispered. I believed him, but I also knew indecision was no longer a luxury I could allow in our house. Then you'll have to figure that out elsewhere, I said, my voice steady, because this house is no longer a holding place for people who don't know where they stand. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He just nodded and walked out the door with Delilah following behind him, triumphant and glowing, like she had won something. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't playing to win. I was playing to be free. That evening, I moved my things back into the master bedroom and opened the windows. I let the stale air out, burned a candle I'd been saving, and sat in the nursery with my hand on my belly. The house felt different without their footsteps echoing through it. Not empty, just mine. I called Aaron again and confirmed everything we had discussed. Deed, financial separation, parenting arrangements if needed. She told me I was smart to act now. While things were calm, I thanked her, not because I felt strong, but because I was finally choosing strength over waiting. The next few days were quiet. Delilah didn't call. Elias sent a few short text logistics. Mostly, he was staying at her house, which I imagined felt less like a home and more like a museum of curated expectations. He didn't ask about the baby. He didn't ask about me. That silence spoke louder than any words. I documented everything, not out of vengeance, but because clarity required record. I kept receipts, screenshots, a private journal. I wasn't preparing to destroy him. I was preparing to survive with dignity intact. Then, one afternoon, I found the family photo album tucked under the couch. It had been rearranged. Pictures of me had been removed or replaced with older ones, of Elias alone or with Vanessa. The ex-Delilah had once tried to reintroduce. But what made my hands tremble wasn't the missing photos. It was the ultrasound image we had taped inside when we first found out. Someone had drawn a faint gold crest over it, a stylized Carter family emblem I recognized from Delilah's stationery. She had marked the child as hers before the child had even arrived. That was the moment I stopped hoping for reconciliation and started building the terms of my peace. The morning after I found the crest drawn over my baby's ultrasound, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't call Elias or send a message demanding an apology. Instead, I stood quietly in the middle of the nursery and looked around at the room we had once painted together. Soft green walls, quiet sunlight, hand-picked books lining the white shelves. I let myself take it in, not for what it had become, but for what I was about to reclaim. Then I took down every item Delilah had inserted her lace cradle sheets, the antique rattle, the framed Carter lineage poem she had hung without asking. I put them in a storage bin and placed it in the garage, not as a gesture of defiance, but as an act of cleansing. That same day, I opened a new savings account under my name only and redirected all freelance payments. I wasn't hiding money. I was preserving choice. I met with Dr. Lang, my obstetrician, who had been quietly concerned for weeks, when I told her that Elias had moved out, that his mother had taken over the house and the narrative. She looked at me for a long time before nodding. Then this is when you begin protecting yourself like you'd protect a newborn, she said. That sentence stayed with me. It became my new center of gravity. I began setting up quiet supports. I called Monique and Tasha, friends I had grown distant from during the fog of the last year, and told them the truth, not everything, just enough to hear their voices soften, to know that I was no longer standing alone. Monique brought over pre-cooked meals and replaced all the herbs in the pantry with doctor-approved teas. Tasha helped me review my insurance paperwork and offered to stay a few nights post-birth if needed. I didn't ask for a rescue. I just needed reminders of who I used to be before I became someone else's footnote. For the first time in weeks, I started sleeping through the night. The house felt still, but not hollow. My steps echoed, not because I was lonely, but because I had space again. I put Elias's remaining clothes into a single bin and stored it in the hallway closet. I left his framed degree on the wall, but added a new print beside it, one of my own, a soft ink drawing of a woman standing on a shoreline alone, not adrift, but anchoring herself. I wasn't erasing him. I was redrawing the scale. Meanwhile, Elias sent the occasional message updates about work, vague questions about the baby's due date, but nothing concrete, nothing meaningful. He never asked if I was okay. He never offered to come to an appointment or help assemble the crib, even though he'd promised once that he wanted to build everything together. I realized then that absence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet sequence of no-shows and unread messages that let you know where you stood. Delilah, however, did not remain silent. First came the angry voicemails accusing me of manipulating Elias and tearing their family apart. When I didn't respond, she shifted tactics. Legal-sounding emails arrived next, challenging my control of the house, citing unfair separation of assets and intentional alienation. I forwarded them all to Erin, who called me one afternoon just to say, "She has no case. Naya, you're not doing anything wrong. You're just finally doing something for yourself." Still, the noise was exhausting. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Delilah standing in the rain, umbrella in one hand, a pale pink baby blanket in the other. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "I just want to be part of my granddaughter's life." Her voice cracked, but I couldn't tell if it was real or rehearsed. I kept the door halfway closed and said, calmly, "That will depend on how much respect you're willing to give the child's mother." Her face stiffened. Her eyes darted toward the hall behind me, searching for signs of Elias, signs that she still had a thread of control to pull, but there was nothing left for her here. She left without a word. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the home I had once thought I would have to leave. Now I knew I wouldn't, not because I had won, but because I had stopped asking to be allowed. This house, this baby, this life, I didn't need permission to inhabit it fully. I just needed to stop shrinking inside it. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the door, I received a message from Elias that was different from the ones before. It was longer, not a question or a schedule check, but a letter. He wrote that he had moved out of his mother's house and into a small apartment near the university. He said he hadn't planned it, but that one night he heard Delilah refer to me as that woman in front of a neighbor, and something inside him finally cracked. He said it felt like watching a slow-motion collapse of a version of himself he no longer wanted to be. I read his words twice. Then I closed the message and didn't reply. It wasn't that I felt anger. It was that I no longer had the urge to explain the difference between regret and repair. He was late, and the part of me that used to wait for people to change had gone quiet. Still, I acknowledged that growth is rare, and when it happens, it deserves some space. So I wrote back 3 days later and agreed to meet for a short coffee, public, neutral, no expectations. He looked thinner, but clearer somehow. He carried himself like someone who'd been cracked open, not shattered, just realigned. I noticed his hands trembled a little when he reached for his cup. "I don't expect to come back," he said quickly. "I just want to be part of the baby's life. I'm getting help now, real help. Therapy, every week." I nodded. "That's good." We talked for half an hour, mostly about logistics, doctor appointments, due dates. He didn't try to tell me who Delilah was or wasn't anymore. He didn't defend her. He only said, "I should have drawn the line years ago, but I didn't know how." I replied simply, "Now you do." We agreed on a shared parenting plan. I set boundaries around visits and communication. Aaron helped draw up basic paperwork. I didn't open the door to reconciliation, but I also didn't bolt it shut. I needed him to understand that being in a child's life came with responsibility, not just intention. He showed up to our final ultrasound appointment on time. He asked questions. He held my coat without being asked. It didn't undo the months that came before, but it gave me one thing I hadn't had in a long time: relief. The day I gave birth. The hospital room was filled with soft sounds and low lighting. Emma arrived at 3:42 in the morning, with a slow, steady cry that sounded more like a protest than a wail. Elias was there, not by default, but because he had earned that right again. He stood beside me, holding my hand, tears falling down his cheeks as he whispered her name. I watched him fold around her like someone who had learned the weight of tenderness too late, but was now willing to carry it fully. Delilah didn't visit the hospital, not because we banned her, but because we made the boundaries so clear she didn't dare cross them. Elias had told her, directly, that she would be welcome only when she could respect our rules. No surprise visits, No comments about race or lineage. No rewriting of decisions. She didn't take it well. She told him he was choosing a stranger over blood. He told her that real family didn't require that kind of trade-off. And for once, he didn't flinch when she threatened to cut him off. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it later, and it was the first time I believed he might actually be free. The early weeks of Emma's life were hard. As all new parenthood is, sleep was broken into fragments. My body ached. I second-guessed myself 100 times a day, but for all the exhaustion. There was a calmness I hadn't expected. The house felt steady. I no longer jumped at the sound of the doorbell or worried about whether someone had moved my books or my blankets. I had re-anchored, and I had built something stable with my own hands. Elias came by regularly, sometimes just for an hour, sometimes longer. He learned how to swaddle, how to heat a bottle without scalding, how to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a bored one. I watched him from the hallway sometimes, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel resentment. I just felt distance. Me on one side of a shoreline, him on the other, and in the middle, a child we had made who connected us only in the ways we allowed. We never discussed the past in detail. There was no grand apology, no dramatic reckoning. There was only structure, consistency, presence, and that was enough. I didn't need a partner who chose me over his mother. I needed one who chose himself, with enough clarity to finally show up whole. It's been a year since that night when I packed his bags and stayed in the house. A full year of building something without waiting for permission, without chasing approval, without asking to be chosen. The silence that used to echo through these walls now feels like peace. The furniture hasn't changed much, but the energy has. It's mine, not claimed out of spite, but grounded through intention. Emma turns one next week. She's standing now, wobbling from couch to table with a grin that makes strangers smile and relatives tear up. I think she inherited that from my grandmother, the quiet ability to soften even the hardest faces. Watching her grow has been the most honest experience of my life. She has no agenda, no filter, just presence. And in that presence, I found my footing. Elias is still in her life, respectfully so. He comes by twice a week. He brings his own diapers and never oversteps. We aren't friends, but we're functional, and that's enough. Sometimes he offers to stay a little longer when I look tired. I nod or shake my head, and he never takes it personally. That shift alone is proof of something maturity, maybe, or simply an understanding that not all repair looks like reunion. Delilah hasn't stepped foot in my home since the baby was born. She sends gifts, most of them expensive, many of them unopened. I don't return them, but I also don't display them. Elias once asked me if I'd be willing to try again, to let her meet Emma one day. I told him calmly that when his mother stopped seeing me as the mistake and started seeing her own behavior clearly, we could talk. Until then, this house is sacred ground, and I won't let history poison the soil under my daughter's feet. I still think about that choice, sometimes the one she demanded he make, her or me, as if women only exist in opposition, as if we are chess pieces, and the king must sacrifice one for the win. What she didn't expect is that I wouldn't wait to see if I'd been chosen. I left the game. I built my own board, and in doing so, I stopped being the pawn. The truth is, people don't always know when they're hurting you, but once they do, and they choose to continue, that's who they are. Delilah knew. She just didn't believe I'd ever enforce the cost. She thought the baby would make me softer, more pliable, But Emma made me sharper, more precise. I didn't become cruel. I just became clear. I started consulting again, slowly at first. A few small branding projects. Then a contract with a parenting tech startup. They loved that I could write copy that felt like conversation. I worked from the dining room, Emma beside me in her high chair, babbling while I drafted campaign slogans. One of them went viral. Parenthood isn't a performance, it's a practice. I didn't put my name on it, but the company offered me a long-term role, and I took it. I work 3 days a week now, fully remote, fully respected. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and Emma's asleep, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and just breathe. No one interrupts me. No one questions my worth. There are no sudden demands for loyalty or silence, just breath, space, and the quiet knowledge that I didn't need to destroy anyone to feel whole. I just had to stop offering myself in pieces. I don't tell this story to make people pick sides. I tell it because too many of us stay quiet when we're being reduced. We think love means endurance, that family means forgiveness without reform, that choosing yourself is selfish. But it's not. It's sacred. And it's the first step to building something real. If you've ever stood at a door where someone asked you to shrink for their comfort, I hope you know this. You can walk away, or you can stay, but only if staying means standing taller than before, not waiting to be picked, not asking for space, just taking it. I didn't win because he came back. I didn't win because she stayed away. I won the moment I stopped needing either of them to validate the ground beneath my feet. I am the choice. I am the root. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to disappear to belong. And maybe that's the real revenge. Not the rage, not the silence, but the calm certainty that I built something no one else can take credit for.